I would like to welcome you to this last lecture of the Jahrhunderte lecture series. It will be, unfortunately, the last lecture of this quarter and more likely of this academic year. So I'm exceedingly chagrined that it shall be the case. Obviously very happy that we shall be spending this time in the august company of my dear friend and colleague Dan Potts. I would also like, obviously, to thank the Coetzee Institute for having so graciously hosted us in this wonderful venue for the length of this lecture series. I would also just like briefly to mention that we will be obviously in contacting our students, graduates, and affiliates by email and informing them of the vagaries of our time, but it is unlikely that we would be able to hold the remaining lecture series and lectures and events programmed for this academic year, but please be, we shall keep you abreast of this. At the same time, I would also like to just give you a short synopsis of today's lecture. It is the last lecture of this so-called 5 leçons. It is about feudalism and its characteristic in ancient Iran. It shall have a twofold vector. On the one hand, it shall look at heraldic symbols on the depiction of late Arsacids and early Sasanian rulers and dynasts, I assume on the reliefs as well as maybe seals. And look at the matter of cognation and agnation in the business of succession in Sasanian Iran. Last word, I would like to thank very much Dan Potts and Hildy Potts for braving their way to UCLA and delivering these conferences despite innumerable and taxing obstacles, and I hope that we shall have the pleasure of having you back again for a reception which had to be mandated, so cancelled for this evening. Thank you so much. Please welcome Dan Potts to the podium.
Well, thank you so much, Rahim. Thank you for having us, and thank you to everyone for braving coronavirus. And actually coming in a gathering. Since we're not dealing with hundreds, I guess it's okay. I have gone in a fairly eccentric fashion through a variety of topics, ranging from prehistory through the Achaemenid period in the last lecture, and now we come to late antiquity, the sort of chronological end of my purview in these lectures on kinship. But paradoxically, having reached the period of late antiquity, when the most data on kinship is available, I find myself consciously avoiding certain topics simply because so much has been written about them by scholars far more specialized in this era than I am. There is already a large body of excellent studies on kinship terminology, marriage patterns, particularly close kin or incestuous marriage, the great aristocratic families, and social organization in Iranian late antiquity by scholars like Arthur Christensen, Touraj Daryai, Sagi Gazarani, Bodil Herold, Heinrich Hübschmann, Maria Matsuk, Katarzyna Maksimiuk, Anahit Perikhanian, Parvaneh Pourshariati, and Prodz Oktar Skiervo. In the interest of contributing something different to the study of kinship and social organization in the last centuries of the pre-Islamic era, I will not go over material already fully explicated by them. I do wish, however, to revisit a topic that has been connected with the Achaemenids, Arsacids, and Sasanians since the 19th century, namely the concept of feudalism in ancient Iran. The characterization of a society as feudal depends, of course, on the definition of feudalism that one adopts, one of which I shall call broadly economic, while the other revolves around vassalage. In the former case, Feudalism describes, quote, the totality of the economic and political relationships of a society, with an emphasis on the exploitation of the peasantry by the exaction of labor services in a closed or natural economy. Lordship over people and land, as well as the institution of the manor, are important. In the case of vassalage, or land for service, a fief, or feudum, was granted in return for 40 days of mounted military service. As Susan Reynolds noted, the 12th century Libri Feudorum, or Consuetudines Feudorum, explained in a conjectural way that feuda were first granted to be held at the Lord's will, then for life, and only later became hereditary. Moreover, as Michael Prestwick observed, when public authority in the Carolingian Empire declined in the 9th century, quote, men commended themselves to lords who granted them lands as fiefs. Fiefs came to be held in primogeniture, and the rights of the lord to certain dues or feudal incidents were given increasing definition. The twin juridical pillars of this definition are thus vassalage, codified through a ritual of obeisance or fidelity, and the benefice, or fief itself, the land granted in return for military service. The granting of land in return for service was not, of course, an invention of the European Middle Ages. The same phenomenon obtained in the ancient Near East and is attested in many different settings, particularly where the written documentation is abundant, such as Mesopotamia and Egypt. In 1956, Georg Wiedengren, the Swedish Iranologist, stressed that the provision of a fixed number of cavalrymen, archers, and chariot drivers was a stipulation that could be found in the 2nd millennium BC at Nuzi, northern Mesopotamia. In fact, paragraph 27 of the Codex Hammurabi stipulated that so-called ilku land, that is, land for service, that had been assigned to a soldier, or interestingly a fisherman, who had subsequently been taken captive, could be reassigned to someone else, but if the original tenant returned, it would be restored to him, as would his service obligation. In her exhaustive review of feudalism in the ancient Near East, Sophie Desmarres-Lafont cited only the Babylonian evidence when dealing with the Achaemenid period, where indeed numerous attestations of land for service or its alternative, silver for service, are attested. But what of Iran proper? 19th century scholars whose principal sources were Herodotus and Xenophon had no hesitation in calling the Achaemenid system feudal. In 1861, the Belgian historian François Laurent wrote that nothing characterized the Persian monarchy so much as the satrapies. This was feudalism minus the hierarchical principle of organization that defines feudal regimes. Similarly, Ernest Renan claimed that the entire Persian Empire was one vast feudality. In 1907, the Danish Iranologist Arthur Christensen identified the origins of feudalism in Persia in the 7 clans privilégiés, one of which was the Achaemenids. Below these were a series of vassals, some of whom had been given land as hereditary fiefs by the great king, although their relationship to the satraps was unclear. Nevertheless, Christensen felt that feudalism remained undeveloped in the Achaemenid era, in part because the Achaemenid kings had a standing army and did not rely upon levies raised by their vassals, as well as a centralized system of administration. In the Achaemenid case, much depends on the interpretation of Old Persian bandaka in the Bisatun inscription. Friedrich Wilhelm König considered the bandaka literally the bound, in the sense that they were bound to the throne of Darius through vassalage. Bandaka was translated as Dienstmänner, or Vasallen, and Gebundene by Georg Wiedengren, subordinate or vassal by Iris Kolditz, and bondsman by Wilhelm Eilers. Wiedengren emphasized that when looking at comparable Neo-Babylonian terms from Mesopotamia, the simple translation servant or slave would be incorrect, failing to indicate the semantic field of the term, which had connotations of a military subordinate. As Ernst Badian noted, Old Persian bandaka, one bound to a superior, especially the king, was the term that Darius used throughout the Bisatun inscription to designate his senior army officers, most strikingly even a member of the 6 families that had assisted in his coup d'etat and hence held the highest position in the Persian aristocracy. As Wouter Henkelmann stressed, in Bisatun, in Elamite, Libar Uri, equivalent of Old Persian Manteta Bandaka, is used for Darius's generals and seems to denote my follower, my vassal, rather than my servant. And Rudiger Schmidt noted that Darius also called 2 of his satraps Mana Bandaka. For Jacques de Morgan, the great vassals or companions of the supreme chief in the Achaemenid Empire consisted of a class of nobility to which the younger branches of the royal family and the principal chiefs of tribes which had taken part in the conquest belonged. The seigneurs themselves and their provincial governments surrounded themselves with their principal subordinates, descendants of those who had served under their ancestors at the time of the invasion. After the conquest, each of the chief vassals was granted or received a territory proportionate to the importance of his tribe, and the same was done for each of the clans, then for the families. Thus a kind of complete hierarchy was established from the owner of a village or a group of tents up to the supreme master, a characterization which, while flatly contradicting Laurent's perception of a lack of hierarchy, seems to owe, in my opinion, just a bit too much inspiration to land tenure in the Qajar period. In a similar vein, the German ancient historian Hermann Bengtson wrote that if one wished to identify the essence of the Persian Empire, it was as a kind of feudal state, even though it changed through time. The feudal vassal system, organized down to the smallest unit, served mainly to secure military service. The sovereignty of certain families, from which the highest-ranking bureaucrats were drawn, was also typical of Achaemenid feudalism, he wrote. Individual satrapies sometimes remained in the hands of the same family over multiple generations, giving rise, in some cases, to satrapal revolts, since the satraps were at the same time great feudal lords. But this was in fact exceptional, as in the case of Phrygia, as pointed out recently by Bruno Jacobs. That is the hereditary nature of the satrapy. For Ernst Herzfeld, on the other hand, the origin of feudalism in Iran 1,000 years before it appeared in Europe lay in the notion that Ahura Mazda distributed to rich and poor their share of land and wealth. In this sense, then, Darius was the feudal liege lord comparable to the much later shadow of God. In 1956, Georg Wiedengren noted that based on Xenophon, the character of these fiefs seems to have changed in the late Achaemenid period and become objects of financial speculation in the hands of craftsmen and workers who no longer supplied manpower for the military. Apart from the fact that Xenophon's testimony may be less than accurate, the evidence cited by Wiedengren was again almost exclusively from the Achaemenid satrapy of Babylonia. More recent studies of Achaemenid feudalism, like that of Thierry Petit, have stressed the importance of vassalage and the pledge of loyalty or homage through proskynesis rather than fiefs. But Christopher Tuplin, to name just one scholar, has criticized the notion that Achaemenid feudalism emerged in the same way as it did in post-Carolingian Europe, that is, in a period of state collapse, weak monarchy, and privatized power, concluding that infantry were more important in the Achaemenid military than cavalry, and that the world of the immortals is radically different from that of the knight in shining armor. Many scholars have stressed that the most compelling evidence of feudal relations in ancient Iran dates to the Arsacid and Sasanian periods. The renowned professor of Semitic languages at the Collège de France, Étienne Marc de Quatremer, considered the petty kings of Armenia, Media, Elamaeus, Adiabene, Bactria, and Gordiene vassals of the Arsacid king, obliged to march when he requested it and to accompany him to war, fighting beneath the Arsacid banner, just as European vassals did for their kings during the Middle Ages, even if in some cases their own power surpassed that of their sovereign. Similarly, in the posthumously published fragments of his History of the Arsacids, Jean-Antoine Saint-Martin reminded readers that according to Strabo, Iran was governed by vassal kings of the Arsacid Great King, and that Ardashir, far from being an obscure adventurer, was one such vassal within the Arsacid feudal structure at the time of his rebellion. As Iris Kolditz observed, although Wiedengren emphasized the comparability of Iranian and European social institutions, and consequently posited a developed form of feudalism in Iran, this applied only to the Arsacid period. Hans-Heinrich Scheder, on the other hand, felt that only in the Sasanian period was there evidence of a fully feudal society. In his 1943 study of Sasanian art, Kurt Erdmann suggested that forms of knighthood were developed in Iran long before they were in the West, which he felt owed much to Eastern influences transmitted much later by returning crusaders. Even so, Turaj Daryai has expressed some reserve, noting that although, quote, the characteristics of land tenure or feudal makeup in the Near East, and in particular in Iran, have similarities with European feudalism, there are major differences as well. Yet rather than throwing the baby out with the bathwater, Josef Wiesehofer has suggested that, quote, although former studies on Sasanian feudalism very often drew unjustified and wrong parallels between Sasanian Iran and the medieval European monarchies, the theoretical parameters of studies on late medieval and early modern courts proved to be quite useful for cutting a swathe through the source material on the Sasanian court and on power and state building in Sasanian Iran. One feature of feudal society implied by the system of vassalage is, of course, the existence of a class of nobility. Arthur Christensen conceived of ancient Iranian society in the Avestan tradition, as reflected in the Gathas, as a structure consisting of 4 tiers: the house, the village, the tribe, and the province. In his opinion, during the Achaemenid period, the king occupied the place of chief of the land, while the former tribal chiefs were replaced by satraps. Below this were the clan chiefs and heads of families or households. These were identified, as Antoine Maillet emphasized, by the names of the heads of these units. In the Arsacid and Sasanian periods, however, we encounter not just these magnates, but the names of families like the Suren, Karin, and Mehran that dominated Iranian society for centuries. As these have been discussed extensively, however, by many scholars, I'd like to turn to a somewhat different phenomenon, namely graphic devices of aristocratic familial identification in ancient Iran, or what might be called pre-Islamic Iranian heraldry. In Europe, as is well known, coats of arms were used to distinguish noble houses, so much so that the study of heraldry and heraldic iconography has long been a field unto itself. So-called heraldic devices, however, have not always been as elaborate as popular images of them might suggest. And in fact, this sample of the devices of Polish noble families recalls the much simpler signs used by some of the Parthian and Sasanian nobility, examples of which have been known since the earliest drawings of Arsacid and Sasanian coins and reliefs began appearing in European publications, such as these examples, published in the supplement to Joseph Pellerin's Recueil des Médailles from 1767, and Karsten Niebuhr's report on his 1765 visit to Fars, published in 1772, where the headgear of 2 of the attendants shows such devices. Neither Pellerin nor Niebuhr offered any thoughts on the meaning of these devices. Several decades later, however, in the 1822 report on his travels, Sir Robert Kerr Porter pointed to Naqshi Rustam I, showing the investiture of Ardashir, that is the rock relief at Naqshi Rustam, showing the investiture of Ardashir with, quote, a beardless youth wearing a high round-topped cap on which is some distinguishing mark, which Kerr Porter thought seems to place him in the same rank with the figure covered with the scroll in the bas-relief of Shapur, and Naqshi Rustam VI, showing Shapur I's triumph, where the bust of Cartier appears wearing a round-topped cap with a sort of badge on its side, and Naqshi Rustam II, showing Bahram II with members of his family and other dignitaries, again wearing headgear, some of which show a crescent with a small circle over it, or the crescent only, or again, a mark on it not unlike that on the fanning attendant in another of the reliefs here. Generally, Kerr Porter suggested, quote, the different flat marks seen on the headgear of these reliefs are likely to have been badges of the respective rank or function of the wearer. These marks quickly found their way into studies on the origins of European heraldry, such as Adalbert de Beaumont's 1853 monograph, L'origine du blason. Even if Richard Fry's comparison between pre-Islamic camel brands and European coats of arms seems somewhat surprising, the use of signs to mark property and to identify families, lineages, clans, dynasties, and high-ranking individuals has been historically widespread in both space and time. There exists a wide variety of what have been called variously heraldic devices, tamgas, emblems, or to use their ancient Middle Persian name, nishan. And it has often been argued that these are the equivalent of later European Wappenzeichen, Wappenartigenzeichen, or blason, that is, heraldic devices. Here, following Robert Goebel, I shall refer to these as tamgas, a word signifying seal in Old Turkic and printing plate in Mongolian. It has been suggested, though, that these are secondary meanings, the first being a property mark, used by a family or clan on livestock, where it appears as a brand, and on other objects. Such signs became so-called Hoheitszeichen, as in the case of the individuals wearing headgear adorned with them on the Sasanian reliefs, only when and if a particular family, lineage, or clan assumed a leading role socially and politically. Thus, this was a further development from the original function and meaning of the tamga as a property identifier. Robert Goebel argued in 1971 that despite the fact that the term tamga was only attested long after the Sasanian period, it was nevertheless the best descriptor available for those heraldic devices which already appeared on the helmets and headgear of the early Sasanian royalty, and which, like heraldic coats of arms, served as unique, unmistakable identifiers of individuals. The study of tamgas has a long history. In Rashid al-Din's History of the Oghuz, we find a reference to the fact that Oghuz told his son Kun Khan that each of the 24 sections of the Oghuz should have its individual sign and tamga in order that their rank, function, and title might be recognized, and so as to avoid internal strife. Similarly, according to the so-called political and military institutes of Timor, the world conqueror gave a dozen of his elite troops each a distinctive mark or tamga. Before looking at the tamgas on the Sasanian reliefs, I'd like to trace the story of one particularly fine object with a tamga that has been known since the 18th century, namely a stunning amethyst seal, or cameo, or gem, whatever you want to call it, originally attributed to Bahram IV, but reassigned by Prudence Harper to Bahram I. This piece offers a fascinating example of the origins and development of scholarship in this field, of the history of collecting and connoisseurship, and of the modification of an ancient object in modern times. The story begins in 1761, when the German gem engraver Johann Lorenz Natter catalogued the gems and seals in the collection of the 4th Duke of Devonshire. The so-called Devonshire collection, kept to this day at Chatsworth, was begun by the 4th Duke's grandfather William, 2nd Duke of Devonshire, who succeeded to the title in 1707 and amassed a large coin collection. Both the 3rd and 4th Dukes added to the collection. In a catalogue dating to 1908, the then Chatsworth librarian and later assistant director of the British School at Rome, Eugenie Sellers Strong, speculated that she thought the 4th Duke had relied on Baron Philip von Stoss for many of his acquisitions, and von Stoss was certainly familiar with the collection, for some of his opinions were quoted by Natter in his unpublished catalogue of 1761. Baron Philip von Stoss, who spent much of his life in Florence and Rome and died in 1757, amassed the largest collection of engraved gems and impressions in the world, 3,444 originals and glass paste copies, and over 28,000 impressions. No less an important figure in the history of archaeology than Johann Joachim Winckelmann catalogued von Stoss's collection after his death. However, von Stoss's adopted nephew, Heinrich Wilhelm Musil-Stoss, who inherited his uncle's estate, was eager to convert the collection into cash, Accordingly, in 1766, he sold the vast majority of von Stosch's engraved gems to King Frederick II of Prussia, while most of von Stosch's 28,000 plus gem impressions, or casts, were acquired by James Tassie in Edinburgh, himself a famous cameo carver. The famous catalogue raisonné of this collection, which he published in 1791, together with Rudolf Erich Raspe, author of The Surprising Adventures of Baron Munchausen, includes an engraving of the cast of the Bahram I seal, made of sulfur, and gives its provenience as the von Stosch collection. As for the seal itself, its provenience before entering the Devonshire collection is unknown. Perhaps the original Sasanian gem was acquired by the 4th Duke of Devonshire from von Stosch's estate after his death in 1757, but before 1761, when Natter catalogued it at Chatsworth, and in this way was not among the roughly 3,500 gems that went to Frederick II of Prussia. On the other hand, we also know that so great was von Stosch's eagerness to have, if not originals, at least a copy of each known ancient gem, that von Stosch may only have owned the impression, later acquired by Tassie, and never possessed the gem itself, in which case it must have entered the Devonshire collection by some other means. Where the gem originated prior to its arrival in Europe is unclear, although in discussing Parthian and Sasanian seals circulating in the late 18th century, Tassie and Raspe noted that they generally came from Basra. Just means from dealers in Basra. In any case, the engraving of the gem published by Tassie and Raspe in 1791 attracted the notice of Sir William Owsley, and a decade later he addressed himself to quote the Pahlavi inscription on a very curious sulfur described in Mr. Tassie's catalogue of gems as belonging to the collection of Baron Stosch. Owsley, however, said nothing about the device shown clearly on Bahram's headgear, nor did Antoine Isaac Sylvestre de Sacy, the eminent French Semitist and Persian scholar, in his review of Owsley's work, which appeared in the same year. In 1815, the Tassie impression and Owsley's publication of it were again discussed by Sylvestre de Sacy. This time, he noted that Bahram's headgear bore a symbolic device or monogram, but he made no attempt to explain it. Meanwhile, as Natter's catalogue of the Devonshire collection from 1761 was not published, unlike the cast of it in the Tassie collection, the existence of the gem itself was presumably known only to the Duke and whomever he showed it to. This all changed, however, in 1856, when the 6th Duke of Devonshire, a bachelor, had it set, along with 87 other ancient gems, by the London jeweller C.F. Hancock, in what has become known as the Chatsworth or Devonshire parure. This remarkable set of jewellery was made to be worn by Countess Granville, the wife of the Duke's nephew, Earl Granville, at the coronation of Tsar Alexander II on 7 September 1856 in Moscow, which they attended as representatives of Queen Victoria. The set of 7 pieces incorporating 88 ancient gems consisted of a comb, bandeau, stomacher, necklace, diadem, coronet, and bracelet. A contemporary description of it lists, quote, a very fine oriental amethyst intaglio as the 7th stone in Hancock's comb. 5 smaller gems were set in a row above 3 larger ones, the central one being the Bahram I gem. As a writer in the Manchester Guardian noted on 28 February 1857, quote, the comb has an elegant form and outline, its chief gem placed in the center of a large, pure, and lustrous oriental amethyst, on which is carved the head of the Persian king of the ancient Sasanian dynasty, with the high cap of the sovereign, and at the side is an inscription in the oldest known form of Persian. This gem is undoubtedly antique, the line of kings deriving their dynastic name from Sasan, the grandfather of Artaxerxes, that is, Ardashir. Within a decade, Edward Thomas called it, quote, the Duke of Devonshire's well-known amethyst, and it quickly entered the literature as the highly prized amethyst belonging to the Duke of Devonshire, the great Devonshire amethyst, the celebrated Devonshire amethyst, and a magnificent amethyst intaglio. Nevertheless, when discussing the Devonshire gem, Thomas lamented that he had vainly sought to obtain a thoroughly satisfactory representation, forcing him to publish a woodcut, which gives a very artistic rendering of the general details, but maybe not very accurate, later superseded by a more accurate one done by a Mr. Williams, who was probably one of the sons of Samuel Williams, who lived from 1788 to 1854 and was a noted engraver. The very fact that Bahram's gem is made of amethyst is also important to note. Prior to the discovery of extensive amethyst mines in Brazil, amethyst was extremely rare, but given its purple color, it was a favorite stone for ruler portraits, like the fine intaglio of Gallienus in the British Museum that you see here. It may also be relevant to note that a dramatic revival of gem engraving, including the use of large amethysts and sapphires of fine style, occurred in the 4th century during the reign of Constantine. Discussing the tamga on Bahram's headgear in 1868, Thomas mistook the highly prized amethyst belonging to the Duke of Devonshire and the cast, published by Tassi and Raspa in 1791, for two different gems, noting that on the Tassi cast, the Parthian helmet, so-called, is adorned with the self-same device as seen on the more valuable gem. In fact, he was talking about the same thing. One the gem, one the impression. But he made no attempt to identify or characterize the tamga. A decade later, Andreas David Mortmann called the device on Bahram's headgear a Zoroastrian symbol. It is tempting to suggest that the device is composed of Middle Persian letters in Bahram's name, but this remains to be worked out by my esteemed colleague, Professor Shayegan. More complex monograms consisting of combinations of letters may be read, as both Jean de Menasse and Robert Goebel demonstrated, but these are clearly much more complex than simple tamgas. Vladimir Lukonin interpreted such monograms as abbreviations of titles or designations of rank. In 1928, Ernst Herzfeld suggested that tamgas were abstractions, abbreviated and simplified versions of originally figural depictions derived from the property ownership marks of previously nomadic peoples that had evolved into clan or lineage markers, variants of which might be used by individuals or families. And in this sense, he felt they truly did mirror European heraldic devices. Whereas distinctive crowns or headgear were used to identify kings and gods, tamgas were used to identify other persons. The tamgas on Sasanian rock reliefs were collected 50 years ago by Eric F. Schmidt in his third posthumously published volume on Persepolis and Naqsh-e-Rustam. Those seen on Ardashir, the first battle relief at Firuzabad, where 3 pairs of combatants are depicted, have attracted particular attention, and I'd like to turn to them now. Read from right to left, the lead combatant at Firuzabad is Ardashir, unhorsing the last Arsacid king, Ardavan. Herzfeld was struck by the tamga covering his horse, or as part of the caparison on his horse, which Roman Gierschmann thought represented the ring and ribbons, or crown and diadem, given by Ahura Mazda to the king in investiture scenes. The crown and diadem shown in investiture scenes are not, however, confined to Ardashir, as these examples of reliefs showing the investitures of Narseh, Chabur II, and Khosrow II clearly show. For Richard Fry, the tamga's placement on the horse ridden by Khosrow II in the great grotto at Takibustan was also telling. As he noted, quote, "Since a tamga was used by Turks and Mongols in branding horses, it is perhaps not inappropriate that the first of the Sasanian signs, first because of its use by Ardashir, is also found on the flank of a horse on a Sasanian relief at Takibustan." In fact, in 1938, Herzfeld had suggested that the presence of the same so-called Diademzeichen, heraldic device of Ardashir's on this horse, which he identified as Shabdi's, Khosrow's famous horse known from literary sources, could imply that the founder of the Sasanian Empire had established a royal stud, which was still going at Khosrow II's time, and from which Khosrow's horse came bearing this brand. If this device is in fact derived from the crown and diadem used in investiture ceremonies, then its appearance at Firuzabad may reflect Ardashir's desire to underscore his legitimacy when appearing in battle, even though he was the one challenging the established king Ardavan. Gierschmann called the device on Ardavan's horse the blason, or the heraldic device of the Parthian king, a ring on a support, noting that it was also attested on the coinage of Arsacid kings, including Vologases III and IV, something that Herzfeld had already observed. It's also emblazoned, as you can see in that right-hand image, on Ardavan's headgear, where he's lying dead at Nakhchi-Rustam. In a slim monograph strongly criticized by Robert Goebel for its superficiality, the German archivist Hans Jennekin noted that the same device appeared on the coinage of Phraates IV and Vologases I, as well as Vologases III. And indeed, it has been chosen recently by Fabrizio Sinisi as the logo for the Siloga Numorum Parthicorum, which you see on the right. A simple interpretation of these co-occurrences would be to suggest a familial relationship between all of these rulers, including Ardavan. But this would probably be incorrect, since we know, for example, that Phraates IV belonged to the Sinetrucid line, that is, the descendants of Sinetruces, who came to power around 78 BC and were probably descendants of Mithridates I, whereas the house of Vologases I, or the Vologasids, represented an entirely different line, descended from Artabanus II and his brother Vonones, a rival line that perhaps originated with Mithridates II. Given the animosity between these two extended families, one would not expect them to have shared the same tamga. As for the selective appearance of the tamga on Arsacid coinage, Fabrizio Sinisi suggested, following David Selwood, that its appearance was usually associated with phases of political unrest, when the king may have sought to distinguish his issues from those of rebels who were challenging his authority. Returning now to the Firuzabad relief, Ardashir's son, the Crown Prince Shapur, is shown riding a horse covered with a different tamga, one that adorns his quiver as well. Herzfeld referred to Shapur's tamga as the Arsacid Ankh sign, embellished with a crescent moon, while Gierschmann called it a crescent mounted on a ring support. In his 1963 review of Robert Goebel's publication of the Sasanian coins in the Royal Numismatic Collection in The Hague, Richard Fry discussed the tamgas of Ardashir and Shapur, suggesting that, quote, inasmuch as the tamga of Ardavan is similar to that of Shapur, minus the crescent on the circle, we may suggest that the sign of Shapur is that of a noble Arsacid family close to that of Ardavan, from whom Shapur's mother came, alluding here to the different traditions surrounding the filiation of Ardashir's wife, who's identified variously as Ardavan's daughter by Tabari, as his cousin in the anonymous Nihayatul Arab, and as the daughter of an unnamed Arsacid nobleman by Dinawari. In 1985, this idea was repeated by Selwood, Whitting, and Williams in their introduction to Sasanian coins, where they saw two possibilities for the origin of Shapur's tamga, which they misleadingly called a dynastic symbol. The first was that it was derived from Ardavan's tamga, as Fry had suggested over 2 decades earlier. The second was that it had so-called Gondopharean or Gondopharean precedents, a notion that goes back at least to 1938 to Herzfeld's paper on Takibustan, and that both Sagi Gazarani and Marek Olbricht have recently embraced, suggesting that the tamga on Shapur's horse and quiver is the same as that used as a dynastic mint mark on Gondopharid coinage, that is, the issues of the eastern Indo-Parthian state that ruled in Sakistan, Drangiana, and Arcasia during the last century BC and 1st century AD. Ulbricht has speculated that the last king of the Gandharid dynasty, Farn Sasan, was Ardashir's father. Although he did not make the connection explicitly, he implied that the Gandharid Tamga and that found on Shapur's horse and quiver are testimony to this familial tie. Ghazarani, on the other hand, following Herzfeld, has suggested that the Gandharid symbol, as she calls it, was a symbol of the house of Suren, whom Ulbricht considers instrumental in bringing Ardashir to power. There is a problem here, though, with this hypothesis, over which Herzfeld, Ghazarani, and Ulbricht all appear to gloss. Simply stated, to my eyes, the Gandharid Tamga and the Tamga of Shapur are not graphically identical. As the examples collected here show, the open circle in the middle of the Gandharid device is topped not by the crescent seen on Shapur's horse and quiver, but by two diagonal lines, either meant to be read as individual lines or as a V atop the open circle. Particularly given the lunar associations of crescents, whether in combination with other elements as seen here or on their own, and their potential religious significance, I would be very reluctant to gloss over this graphic difference between these two signs. Finally, we come to the third Sasanian nobleman depicted at Firuzabad, who wears headgear decorated, in Giersman's words, with a form of a flower, a tamga that appears on his horse as well. Giersman suggested that this figure was the page, who is also shown holding a fly whisk behind Ardashir at Naqshbastan. In stepping back for a moment and considering the subject of Sasanian tamgas, several points immediately stand out. It is certainly true that the presence of tamgas on the horse caparisons of Ardavan, Ardashir, Shapur, and the page at Firuzabad clearly recalls the same practice in medieval Europe. But it is striking that the nearly 36 Sasanian rock reliefs known to us were commissioned by only 9 of the 31 rulers attested between 224 and 651, that is Ardashir I, his son Shapur I, great-grandson Bahram II, Narseh, Ormazd II, Shapur II, Ardashir II, Shapur III, and Khosrow II. Furthermore, of the 9 rulers who left rock reliefs, only 2 displayed an identifying tamga on their headgear or other equipment, that is Ardashir I and Shapur I. The other figures who bear tamgas are unidentified Sasanian elites or dignitaries in association with Ardashir, Shapur, and Bahram II, as well as the last Arsacid king, Ardavan IV or V, the Mobed Kartir, and an unidentified opponent of Ormazd II. On the other hand, none of the Sasanian magnates or officials depicted alongside Shapur I at Darab, for example, has a tamga on his headgear. So in brief, the selectivity we see in the distribution of tamgas on Sasanian reliefs would not suggest that these were considered as important as, for example, the heraldic insignia of European knights. Nevertheless, tamgas are visible on a large number of Sasanian seals and coins, where they are generally referred to by numismatists as Beitzeichen. In addition, there are the true monograms to consider, which are clever combinations of letters, often in mirror image, upside down, or at an angle, which can be read, as Goebbels, Menas, and more recently Ghislain and Monsef have shown. Over 60 years ago, Hans Jennekin documented 75 different monograms on Sasanian stamp seals, and I'm sure that number is much greater today. For the most part, these do not overlap with the tamgas seen on Sasanian rock reliefs, nor do the Beitzeichen on Sasanian coinage, probably because monograms, as Fry pointed out, were usually representations of names, although the principle that all Sasanian monograms on seals represent the name or legend on the rim of the seals is in many cases false. In fact, in his 1798 treatise on monograms, Johann Christoph Gatterer noted that monograms, whether on coins, flags, walls, or tapestries, seals, or documents, fell into 3 categories: nominalia, titularia, and verbalia, that is, names, titles, or words, or a mixture thereof. The significance of tamgas for the identification of Sasanian society as feudal is thus in need of qualification. However important even the selective use of tamgas in the Western Iranian world may have been, it is an undeniable fact that on the steppes from Inner Asia to Hungary, tamgas were much more widespread in space and time than they ever were in Iran during the Arsacid and Sasanian periods, and their episodic and indeed inconsistent use in late antiquity throws their significance into some doubt. If they are deemed a marker of feudalism, then many more societies of the first millennia BC and AD will have to be considered candidates for that designation as well. Finally, the last topic I wish to address in connection with feudalism brings us back to the problem of descent, and specifically the claim that as a feudal society, Sasanian society followed a strictly agnatic principle of inheritance and succession. To briefly remind you of the distinction between agnates and cognates, let me simply quote Radcliffe Brown and Darrell Ford, who wrote, quote, "To define the kin of a given person, his descent is traced back a certain number of generations, and all descendants of his recognized ancestors through both females and males are his cognates. Within the body of a person's recognized cognates, certain are distinguished as agnates. Cognates are agnates if they are descendants by male links from the same male ancestor. Thus, agnatic kinship may be defined as unilineal descent through males." As the German jurist Burkhard Wilhelm Leist noted in 1892, however, patria potestas and agnation are distinctively Roman and reflect an historically very particular social pattern. Nevertheless, so enshrined was agnation in European concepts of monarchy that on occasion its abrogation via legislation or royal decree was considered impossible by legal experts, such as the German political philosopher Friedrich Julius Stahl. Appealing to the authority of a kind of naive historical ethnography, supporters of this idea, like the Armenologist Nicholas Adonce, claimed that, quote, "in the early periods of history, law or custom kept to an agnatic basis. That is to say, it recognized the right of inheritance only in the male line of descendants." Further, he wrote, quote, "In the feudal world, land passed along the agnatic line from father to son or to brother, with the exclusion of women from the line of succession. Since feudal land tenure was conditional upon military service, women, because of their incapacity to fulfill this obligation, naturally had to be excluded from the right to hold land. Similarly, in a tribal society, the non-participation of women in land inheritance was explained by their inability to fulfill the tribal obligation of the blood feud, which corresponded to the military service of the feudal period. This proposition was embraced by the late Sasanian specialist Anahit Perikhanian, and more recently it has been adopted by both Parvaneh Pourshariati and Richard Payne. The trouble is, as Maria Matsuk has shown, while agnation may have been the normative claim in late antiquity, reality was often very different. Discussing the genealogy of Ardashir I, for example, she noted that, quote, "whereas At-Tabari offers a lineage which is flawlessly patrilineal, that is, descent by the male line, making Sasan Ardashir's paternal grandfather, other sources, such as the Karnamaki Ardashiri Pabagan and Agathias, offer far more complicated family ties, mixing two distinct descent groups. Ardashir is linked patrilineally by his natural father, Sasan, to Dara, and hence to a legitimate dynasty of sovereigns, but he also has a blood link to his legal father, Pabag, by descent from the mother." Similarly, the Danish scholar Bodil Hjerrild pointed out that in Sasanian society, while the idea of a patrilineal lineage certainly existed and male authority was expressed in the institution of guardianship, there was no agnatic right of inheritance. Only sons inherited properties and positions, no other male relative. In fact, in sub-Saharan Africa, as Audrey Richards noted in 1950, quote, "over time, a maternal link may be treated as though it were a paternal link, and therefore within the genealogical structure of the principal lineage of the community. In this manner, cognation comes to be regarded for ordinary social purposes within community life as equal to agnation, When people live together as members of the same small local community, female links are often given equivalents to male links in a genealogy. But further complicating the issue and exposing how simplistic some attempts to see agnation in ancient Iran have been is Richard's observation that, quote, in any large village or camp, there is represented an agnatic lineage of one or another order, and that into the growth of this lineage are grafted, into the growth, are grafted through the tracing of descent through females, branches which are regarded in certain situations and in a certain sense as part of it, and in other situations and in a different sense as not being part of it. Clearly, any declaration to the effect that agnation operated everywhere and always in Sasanian Iran is a blunt and unsophisticated appraisal that reflects ignorance of the distinction between a normative ideal and the messy reality experienced by living, breathing societies. This was succinctly expressed by Maria Mazzuk in her contribution on Sasanian kinship to the Gerardo Gnoli Festschrift, when she wrote, quote, the structure of a family was only seldom as simple as the ideal case, and there are strong cognatic elements in the Sasanian kinship system, such that the acceptance of females as intermediary successors gives Sasanian kinship a cognatic tinge. For as Mazzuk stressed, going back to the opinion of some of the 19th century authorities I quoted, Sasanian law did not know the legal concept of primogeniture. There was no primus agnatus, as in Roman law. Moreover, as the example of Queens Borandocht and Adar Midocht make clear, succession to the highest office by females was also a possibility in the late Sasanian period. To conclude, as these lectures have tried to shine a social anthropological light on ancient Iran, let me give Marshall Salins, one of the most important anthropologists of the latter 20th century, the final say. In 1965, he wrote, "Descent is not recruitment, but arrangement and alignment. In the first place, a principle of political design, exercising arbitrary constraints on the suppositions of ancestry. This holds true for much of what has been said in my talks, during the course of which we have examined many such suppositions. The status of the sister's son, preferential marriage, and classificatory kinship all reflect strategies and choices, often at odds with the suppositions of archaeologists, ancient historians, and philologists. But the peoples of ancient Iran in all periods must be considered through the same lens used to view any culture. When we unlock some of the mysteries of kinship relations in ancient Iran, we enhance our understanding of this endlessly fascinating region. This is not a case of privileging the views of anthropologists over those who study the past, merely of adding to the arsenal analytical tools that have long been available, if too often underutilized. Thank you for your time.